Hello, welcome to my channel, or welcome back if you've been here before. My name is Beth Ann, and I am trying to wrap up my nonfiction November reads. I already did a part one, which was sort of the science-y books. There was one about a wolf scientist and one about fungi, so I'll link to that down below. But I have two other nonfiction books that I read in November that I want to talk about, and because I like to keep my videos short, I think I'm actually going to split them up too. So this will be my nonfiction November part two, and then there'll be a part three coming down the line. So I want to talk about Dare to Lead by Brene Brown. Again, sorry for the backwards writing on the screen because I'm filming this on my phone. Brene Brown, I assume, needs no introduction. She's a social psychological researcher and a brilliant motivational speaker who deals with a lot of leadership and how to become better leaders and what's sort of the psychology of that. And I picked this book up on a whim. Actually, I think it might have even been a random airport purchase. And I really enjoyed it. And it was also really digestible. I read it basically in a day, maybe a little bit more than a day, but not more than 36 hours or so. Really digestible and really easy to read. And what I loved about this, because I don't necessarily think of myself as a leader in most situations, but she has a very inclusive definition of leadership. So I'm just going to open that up here. She says, I define a leader as anyone who takes responsibility for finding the potential in people and processes, and who has the courage to develop that potential. As a former educator, I really vibe with that. As a parent, I really vibe with that. And of course, a lot of the lessons and wisdom in here are really translatable to leadership in the workplace, but also just to like building relationships. That's so much of what this book is if you're in any kind of leadership or mentoring position, really just showing up as a whole person and building a relationship in that context. She is very careful to kind of frame that. Like, she wants leaders to be vulnerable, but not to overshare, right? Because if you're in any kind of leadership or mentoring position, there is a power dynamic. And so of course, you need to be aware of that. So she has one example of what she means by what a daring leader might say, say in a situation where there's a lot of uncertainty or change. So she says, you might say, these changes are coming in hard and fast, and I know there's a lot of anxiety. I'm feeling it too, and it's hard to work through. It's hard not to take it home. It's hard not to worry, and it's easy to want to look for someone to blame. I will share everything I can about the changes with you as soon as I can. And then she opens up almost like sort of a workshopping session where she says, I want to spend the next 45 minutes rumbling on how we're all managing the changes. Specifically, what does support from me look like? What questions can I try to answer? Are there any stories you want to check out with me, and any other questions you have? So just the idea that you can sort of show up and be emotionally available without going crazy with it. And she doubles down on this idea of being yourself. She's actually quoting someone else, Jim Hollis, who says, we are not here to fit in, be well balanced, or provide exempla for others. We are here to be eccentric, different, perhaps strange, perhaps merely to add our small piece, our little clunky, chunky selves to the great mosaic of being. So I just really like that, the idea that you need to show up and be present and be authentic. And that's a huge part of building relationships and a huge part of being a leader. And then she has a really lovely section that's about defining your values. And I think that's really important, at least for me to think about, because that idea of values gets thrown around so much in terms of an individual aspect, but also in terms of institutional values. And we're sort of constantly hearing about institutions, organizations, businesses touting their values, and they're always kind of vague and aspirational, right? And you kind of think, well, what does that mean? And at least if you're me, I can be quite cynical and skeptic. So if it's a for-profit entity that says it has values, I never believe that. I don't think about it. But she makes a good argument that values, if your values translate into actual behaviors, and things where there's sort of accountability to do those behaviors in line with your values, that can be really, really powerful. This book is it gives a lot of information, and I think sort of inspires a lot of thought. And then there are a few activities kind of spaced through it that you can do or not as you like. But one that I would kind of like to do is she does include a list of possible values. She has a ton of them in here. And the thing I thought was so interesting was, if you tell me to pick, what are my values, I would immediately start a laundry list of all the values that I think are important. And she says, nope, you have to pick 2, and that's it. What are your 2 most important values? And then she talks about how do you distill those into discrete behaviors that you can actually do and hold yourself accountable to doing. So I really like that action-oriented way of thinking about values. And then she even digs into some examples. She talks about some of her personal examples, but from like the profit side of things, or I guess, I don't know if her organization is a nonprofit or not, but anyway, she talks about the values that her organization has. And so, for example, one of them is be brave. And then she talks about the behaviors that she has sort of operationalized within that. And so one of them is, I set clear boundaries with others, which is a very brave thing to do. I lean into difficult conversations, meetings, and decisions, and I talk to people, not about them. So those are all things that are very difficult to do, and I think take a strong will and a strong decision to do those things. So just an example of how to not let values be these like fluffy aspirational things that don't actually mean anything or result in anything, and have them be real outcomes. And then a final piece I really liked was she comes back to the idea of stories, which came up in that original little passage I read about vulnerabilities, but the idea that everybody in every situation has their unique story about what's happening, and that story is in their head, and it's something we all do unconsciously. But having kind of the meta awareness to pause for a minute and be able to communicate that, because it's really powerful if I have my own story and you have your own story about a situation, to be able to say, okay, here's the story I'm telling myself. Can you share your story with me? And then you can maybe proceed when you have a better understanding of what's going on for each of you. So she uses a relationship story of a silly fight with her husband that didn't need to happen, but where the thing to do to kind of head it off is to basically say, like, wait a second, here's the story I'm telling in my head. And the story she was telling herself in her head was pretty ridiculous. Like, she was coming into the situation with so much baggage and having had a bad day. And so the story she was telling herself in her head was really kind of blowing the situation out of proportion. But having that ability to kind of put the brakes on and remember that everyone has a different story, even if you're experiencing the same situation, can be really productive for leading to a good outcome. So again, just a lot of great takeaways and food for thought, I felt, and in just such an easily digestible book that was easy to tear through. This is the sort of thing that I could imagine keeping on my shelf and just sort of flipping through occasionally, maybe every 6 months or every year, and just being like, oh, what were the main ideas? Am I sort of carrying those through in terms of how to better my relationships, how to better my work life and my work relationships? So I found this really inspiring. And yeah, like I said, I'm going to keep it around as a reference. So Brene Brown, definitely going to be picking up more of her work. If there's anything you've encountered by Brene Brown that you'd like to recommend in the comments down below, please let me know. Thank you. Bye.